was Lucy de Grashoff. They were artisans in Germany and had emigrated to Russia together with Estonians and Russians and a French woman. They are my predecessors. She's probably not a French woman, but a Luxembourg, again, Cardinal Hollerich. I have to say that I was also trained in the Orthodox faith. I was active in a church with Greek Orthodox and Romanian Orthodox and also German believers. I also led a multinational a parish in Eupen, close to the border between Belgium and Germany. And I also taught at the university. I have Greek, Ukrainian, Moldavian, and Belarusian students, but also many Turkish, Albanian, and Maghrebian students. My wife is German. One of my sons is married to a wife with British roots. Another one is living together with a woman with Baltic roots. I am a European. Father Miron, I would also like to ask you about your presidency in the working group of Christian churches in Germany. I am from Switzerland, and we do have a very divided approach to the developments in the churches. What makes up Europe for you? It's very good that you told me that you were from Switzerland, because Switzerland during the war was somehow neutral. The historians sometimes have a hefty dispute about that, to which extent the Swiss were really neutral, but they were not directly involved in the Second World War, certainly more indirectly involved. And I would observe, by ways of provocation, that Europe has something to do with the war, just like this desire for unification and unity in Europe. Certainly, this desire arose from the damage that this war caused. And I think that we still witness this situation. Europe is a community of people. I don't know whether we can really say that as a community of persons who are traumatized by war. And this is certainly also why we want to become active for Europe. I am a bit standoffish when it comes to having this theological debate about Europe. I personally think that God really loves all people, all individuals, all nations equally. However, the fact that Europe underwent this war, the First World War was already mentioned by Mr. Krieger. This First World War caused traumas, and so did the Second World War. And before those two world wars, we had other wars waging on our continent. And I think that is very specific for Europe. It's decisive for the politics and also for the churches. Indeed, Europe of the traumatized. We also have a question from the participants, from Walter Lucy. I don't think we can simplify and talk about one European identity. Can we describe such a European identity? Cardinal Hollerich, would you agree that Europe is a Europe of traumatized people for one generation? Yeah, well, I certainly belong to that generation myself, because I remember being a child before television came along. I listened to the stories about from my aunts and uncles and parents and grandparents, and they talked a lot about the war. The Luxembourgers suffered a lot from the occupation by the Germans, and they didn't say the Germans; they said the Prussians. The Prussians, and that was negatively connotated, definitely. But nowadays, I really feel that the Germans are my friends. I studied Germanic studies, and when I was living in Japan, I felt something when I heard the European anthem, for example, also Fraternità Italia or the Marseillaise. These national anthems, they mean something to me. And the European anthem, that is something which is very important for me nowadays. But the national anthem of Germany was something that my family, my parents and my grandparents suffered under. It was the anthem of the oppressors. And I think, in a way, that is the fruit of the further developments. There is a kind of German identity, and there isn't. If you regard identity as something solid and unmovable, then you will perhaps not quite be able to grasp it. But this kind of identity that I think about is something that fluctuates, that evolves. It is differently shaped for different Europeans. Identity or identities as a feeling, as an emotion, something that you feel when you hear national anthems. What does that mean for you, Mr. Krieger? You were mentioning your grandparents who had to switch overnight from German to French nationality or citizenship. What is the uniting factor in Europe? Please unmute yourself. Well, I probably belong to a slightly younger generation. The war is something that I was told about. It was very present at the time, yes. But Europe, to me, means a project to which you can freely and voluntarily commit. And our states, our nations have committed to that. It's the space of freedom and justice and peace for the well-being of their citizens. And obviously, the European Union takes the lead in representing this unity. But if you talk about it from the angle of the churches, then we go far beyond that feeling, because peace, solidarity, and liberty cannot only be limited to 27 member states of the European Union. We also think of the community of nations, of course, which is why we feel it's important to work on education for democracy. The Council of Europe is extremely important for promoting this unity. So it's a project of personal liberty and freedom and peace. And in my view, it should be a Europe of unity and diversity with our cultures, with our religions, with our denominations, which accepts simply to reconcile us. Is the CEC a good model and a good project for leading up to such a united conference? I should think so. We will probably be talking about the organizations that you represent. To which extent is that a mission of the CEC? What does the CEC do in the European Union? You were saying earlier on, and that's also a question from the participants, is it only the European Union or does Russia belong to Europe in this context? The CEC is an organization for ecumenism among 42 countries of Europe, and historically they worked for peace and reconciliation in the heart of Europe. And they wanted to bring about a more justified, a more equitable world in the name of the churches. We only have a small office. We only have 10 people working at the office, and the expectations are obviously very high. And I think that we can take on board many different ideas and projects, because we have understood all along that Europe, for us as the churches, is something that is worth participating in to shape the future concepts and the values. We try to simply be the mouthpiece, basically, of the churches in Europe. We have an office in Brussels and one in Strasbourg, and we also take up different topics, the environment, for example, human rights. Many of the social questions are taken up by us, and also, obviously, the future of Europe. Thanks very much. Father Miron, you also wanted to join in. Yes, I would just like to thank you for this statement. You said that Europe was more than just the European Union or the Council of Europe. May I perhaps remind you of the dramatic founding of the CEC, which had to take place on the open sea because there was a problem with visas for the GDR representatives, and they were not allowed to enter Denmark at the time. And it was a stroke of genius to simply organize this founding conference on the open sea. And this made it possible for the delegates of the socialist countries to join in the founding of the CEC. And it was a stroke of genius because this very limited idea of Europe was broken into pieces at that time. It was understood that Europe went far beyond a group of nations that defined the inclination of cucumbers. As a human being who observed this very closely, I thought it was very complicated that the Pope spoke about the two sides of the lungs, with one eastern and one western part forming one organ. I don't think that we can any longer stick to that sort of description of the CEC. It's important to be working on the wholeness of this picture and this movement. And that is what we expect of the CEC and also of a European churches convention. You simply have to bear in mind the full picture. You already mentioned now who belongs to the CEC and who doesn't. The Catholics don't belong there because they have their own organization, like the Commissy. Cardinal Hollerich, why do you need your own organization? What do you do? We also do a lot. We do have a huge diversity in the Catholic Church. I think that this is also very visible in the German-speaking region of the Catholic Church. We're very pragmatic. Commissy does not base itself on the a uniform picture of Europe. We feel that it's important to be in dialogue with the organizations present in Europe. So we do represent the conferences of the European Union, not of the whole of Europe, with a very concrete mandate. And that is the dialogue with the institutions of the Union. So the Council of Europe, for example, is outside our competencies. We have a secretariat in Brussels where roughly as many people work as in the CEC, and these are very important people because they're very knowledgeable. They, on a daily basis, they are in touch with the institutions. We do have two institutions, but Commissy and CEC cooperate very closely, because I think it's obvious that, of course, we all base ourselves on the same gospel, and we almost share all our opinions on the majority of political problems. So it's very good to use all the opportunities to stand up together. Yesterday, for example, we met the Portuguese foreign minister together and talked together with him about the main thrust of the Portuguese presidency in the European Union. And we coincided in saying that it's very, very important to join forces and not get lost in the details. Churches very often have a very broad view on individual questions, and they can also bring a lot of pressure to bear for finding positive solutions. Next to the Commissy, there's also the representation of the Holy See. I do represent the bishops only, so we're not the only representative organ of the Catholic Church. And we're very closely networking with the bishops' conferences in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, just like the CEC. So I think we have a very harmonious cooperation.
Streichen darf.
Krieger, ja.
Ja, wir sind uns gemeinsam bewusst. like to emphasize the following. We are jointly conscious of the fact that peace and reconciliation can only be preached if the churches do it jointly, if they don't stand up separately. I think we are of one opinion in this respect, and especially today we want to emphasize this. Well, this is something we like to hear. Thank you very much. An organization in which the Protestant churches in their diversity and the Catholic churches is the ACK, the National Council of Christian Churches. Father Rado Konstantin Myron, you're president for Germany. What about Europe? Well, we have a group which doesn't exist officially, namely the Encounter of the NCCs, the National Councils of Churches. In other countries, they are called Kirchenräte, church councils. And we have this non-translatable word of the Working Party of Christian Churches, which we also call the National Council of Christian Churches. In Germany, there were political reasons to call it like that in Germany, but we have this exchange going on sporadically in this respect. We have another project in Germany, which I always like to mention because it has an Orthodox founder or founding father, the day of the Ecumenical Day of the Creation, which is celebrated ecumenically this year in September in the whole of Germany, and this year, in the year of ecumenicalism, we will also have cross-border actions together with our sister organizations in Switzerland and in Austria, and especially around Lake Constance, where the three countries meet. And in September in Linda, Bregenz, and Romanshorn, we will organize ecumenical events at different locations. We'll use a boat to get to these different locations, pray jointly. And we will also initiate concrete projects, because that's one of the characteristics of this day of creation. I mean, it's obvious our being Christian in the two large churches in Germany, or in the small churches in Germany. We have also an abbreviation, AKK, in Germany for this, which becomes more and more known. Churches which are small in Germany, but are majority churches in other countries. And irrespective of the background we have, being Christian can never be something national. And I apologize if I say this here on this panel, it can not be only European either. We have learned to think in national ways, but then we realized what changes were brought about in the ecumenical landscape, which we observe. We have different churches from all over the world now, also in Germany. Not all of them are already in the ACK and our National Council of Christian Churches, but through conventions, these parishes work together through missionary works. So we establish relations, and Christianity with just a look at one's own confession, at one's own denomination, is something which is not timely anymore and is not practiced anymore, I'd say. Now we also have a few questions from the public. What do the churches do concretely in terms of climate protection? How do they contribute actively to the wounds in the Balkans being healed, or as to the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland? What do they do to bring about peace there? Mr. Hollerich, could you tell us a concrete example of what you're doing in the field with your organization in this respect? Or Herr Krieger? Yes, I'll make the start. Very often people ask us to cooperate in difficult and tricky questions. For example, right now, on the situation of Armenian captives in Karabakh Mountain. We in Nagorno-Karabakh, with the resources we have, we then try to help, speak to the European Union, to the officials for external relations, as to sensibilize them also for the human side of the matter. And when the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, which used to be a museum in Constantinople, was to be turned into a Muslim place of worship, we also talked to our partners in the European Union, with the OECD, with the Council of Europe. And when it comes to climate protection, the CEC has executive staff, which we made available for these works inside the European Christian Network on Climate Change. This is a structure we have set up and which we made available to reach this networking between churches, which is necessary for local actions which have to bring about this transformation for a more climate protective environment. This is one concrete example. Thank you very much, Mr. Hollerich. Well, our measures are at the same level. We have a permanent dialogue with the European Commission, with the External Action Service, with the European Parliament, with all instances of the European Union. And especially as to the environment, we have now an alliance, which is called ELSIA, European Laudatio Si Alliance, which we have established, in which we try out something new, because we are the representatives of the bishops, you could say. And here we work together with various Catholic organizations, Caritas Global Climate Movement, Categorical Climate Movement, for example, Sitzer and others. And this creates some sort of synodality. And in this respect, we try to reach the episcopats, because not everything that we do in Brussels is really shared by the bishops. We have to promote these issues first. And I believe we are reaching in Europe, or we need in Europe, a change of mentality. Climate change can only be successful if somehow we can leave the current consumer society, which means that we will have to live less comfortably, but more actively. And this is something that we can do. We are not politically active. We talk to the politicians, but I'm not an elected member of a parliament, so I don't deem myself a politician. But what we can do is that we contribute to a change of mentality, which I believe is necessary in Europe. And what I really deplore in the course of these last week is the question of refugees. I'm working in a network with a group who monitors the Mediterranean. And in this respect, I'm being told, for example, a boat with so and so many refugees turned up, was then rejected, had to sail back to Libya or wherever, or another boat sank. So the reality has become very hard. We're talking about the European values, but they seem to be valid only for the so-called European citizens. And well, when it's convenient also as to our external policy or our trade policy. But human rights, whether they really are valid for every human being, that every human being has a right on asylum. This is something we really have to commit ourselves to. So how do you do it concretely? We try to talk to people time and again. Very often we fall back to the same discourse. We're talking about migrants, refugees, and sometimes we hear things and we ask the people, but do you really know? Have you talked to the refugees? And we have also clear demands, no controls at the external borders, for example. And we repeat and repeat our requests, whether people like it or not, whether we talk to politicians who call themselves Christians or others. And I think for these people, we really have to stand up. And that's what we do. And that's what we do together with the CEC. And this also answers another question in the CEC. Why don't organizations come together when it comes to refugees? But you're saying that that's exactly what you do, right? Yes, we are in a constant dialogue. And I believe that we stand up for exactly the same positions there. The representatives of the Protestant churches in Germany, well, when I listen to them, when they talk on the issue of refugees, I can honestly say I can sign up to all of this. Now I see that there are also participants which would like to have the floor. Lars, I'd like to hear your question. If you want, you can ask your question now. Sorry, maybe that is a little bit abrupt, a little bit sudden, but if you're online, I mean, you put a question to us you would like to ask. So if you want to have the floor, we could give you the floor, but somehow it doesn't seem to work. The person seems to be present, but the mic doesn't seem to be on. Yeah, it's a little bit more complicated, as if we had been able to come together in the same room, Cardinal Ulrich. Yes, I only wanted to say that's why CEC and Commissé do not become a joint organization. I think the way we do it at the moment is quite good, because each of our two organizations has its strengths and weaknesses, and we can always rely on the other organization when we see that in one field we're not so well organized, that we have our weaknesses. So there seem to be different. So I could say that there are different identities, but we do not fight each other because we believe in the same gospel. Therefore, I think that the situation we have at the moment is a win-win situation, and that is better than a mega organization formed from the two current organizations. I'd also like to take the floor, Ms. van der Auwe. I think we also need a certain balance, basically. If you consider that the Committee unites about 2 million Europeans, and the CEC has 3 church families with maybe 130 million, and is well balanced. And the current constellation is a very good one, because that means that the ecumenical work can be done from inside the CEC. And from that point of view, we talk to the Catholic Church the way we did it yesterday. For example, yesterday when we met the Portuguese foreign minister and said, could Europe not put the European question, could Europe not separate the humanitarian question from the refugee or migrant question, and can first help when ships arrive or when ships sink, or when we see the hotspots in the camps? Couldn't we somehow separate the humanitarian question from the political question, because the humanitarian question is also a very complex one, but we have first to think about the fact that these are human beings. Well, isn't this something which you can criticize the churches for? Human dignity, well, that's a part of the entire thing, but it cannot be all. You have to be human or humane, but then you have to think about how things continue in these countries with these people, with these human beings. Can these things really be separated, or this more an ecclesiastical question? Well, I think if somebody sits in a Zodiac boat in the Mediterranean, the first thing to do is to help him is to take him out of that boat. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do other things as well, but saving, rescuing human lives has to be a priority. Certainly, as we also said yesterday, we also need a more just world. The trade agreements have to change. People need wealth, prosperity in their own countries, those that they can have a future, that the young people can have dreams, and that their only dream cannot be just Europe, so that families can also be happy in those countries themselves. But this means a change of the current political structures, of the current trade agreements. It's a very complex situation. We're not going to change that overnight, but we, CSC and Committee together, point out time and again where the problems are, and we also make tangible proposals as to how we could advance. I'm also look into the participant list, and I see that there is Frau Schumacher. I would like to ask a question. I'll try to give you the floor so that you could ask your question. If you could switch on your mic or unmute your mic. I didn't have a concrete question. I've also read the question. That was a misunderstanding, sorry. Well, thank you very much. But now we know that this function also works, that it is possible for participants in the public to ask a question. As to the questions we have here, many deal with the refugee policy and the role of the various organizations. You, Cardinal Horderich, said that it's helpful that there are various organizations that we can sort of level out our strengths and weaknesses, that the current situation is better than if we had just one large mega organization. And I'd like to turn around this question and this topic a little bit, if I may. There are many organizations who deal with refugee questions, with climate protection, justice, peace. And my question is, what can churches do? And this is a question I address to all of you, also the ACK, the National Council of Christian Churches. How can churches contribute? And that against the backdrop that societies, at least in Europe, are in some sort of secularization movement at the time. So what is the added value of what the churches can do? You mentioned your conference on the future, Ökumenischer and CEC. What is the added value you could create? Cardinal Hollerich, please.
Besteht, dass wir zusammenführen können. Es ist ja nicht so, dass wir sozusagen all die anderen.
I think this added value would be that we can bring people together. We're not ignoring NGOs or others who contribute to refugee work. No, we're some sort of collective movement. In Brussels, there is a permanent dialogue, and this dialogue is not a denominational dialogue. And I'm always pleased when I hear something about the ecumenical church in Germany. And we can be a speaker, a very strong and loud speaker for these issues. But I think we as Christians also have a responsibility for the world, because we have we have to love the next person. And Franciscus writes that loving your neighbor, loving the next person is something that have to be seen also on the level of social policy. In a globalized world, this love has to be experienced in a global way. And this has political repercussions. And this is what we stand for. This is nothing that the Pope invented. A Protestant Christian or an Orthodox Christian can come to exactly the same conclusion. But that is the important thing. That is what we need. As a Christian, I cannot only be locked up in a private piousness, but I also have a responsibility for my brothers and sisters. I need courage, I need intelligence, and I need discernibility.
Es ist nicht nur evangelisch.
So it's not only Catholic or Protestant, it's secular. And I would like to ask you, Father Miron, does it have to be Christian? What makes it Christian or over and above the secular movement? Well, I am in Frankfurt, and the motto of the ecumenical churches convention or Kirchentag is look at it closely. And I feel that it's important to actually look at each other, look at the member churches of the CEC, for example. And I think that is also true for others, not only for the ecumenical church in movement in Germany. And it's also true for the churches in the CEC. We live in times of different velocities. Something that is taken for granted in one church is highly disputed in another church. For example, we celebrated 20 years of the Charta Ökumenischer and found that for many, this has already been shelved. Some very courageous people adopted it 20 years ago, and it's nicely bound in leather and is shelved. And for some other churches, this is new territory. It's a discovery. And I think it's important to enter in a dialogue about this. Perhaps some of us need to come to terms and feel at home with the terminology used in the Charta Ökumenischer. Sorry. I don't want to avoid talking about secularism and about those non-Christian decision makers, but I feel that we need to pledge also a community of all the Christian denominations and churches, particularly in Germany. We have just had a very nice experience about the new apostolic church. They have joined as a guest member our working group, and only 10 or 15 years ago, this was unimaginable. And our friends in the new apostolic church tell us it would have been unthinkable so many years ago. So now they're on our lists, and they will certainly participate in the delegate meetings once we return to physical presence meetings again. And we will have to take up that dialogue. We will have to ask them, do you understand the terminology? Does it mean anything to you? Just as we need to learn their discourse or understand their discourse and understand their terminology. I think the ecumenism is always also a movement to further develop a new territory, new activities, but sometimes we neglect the status quo. And I feel that in all of our instances and bodies, we have some centrifugal powers in place. And I say this because you were talking about the divisive powers and the separation of churches. I would really launch an appeal for a multilateral church movement. Mr. Krieger, I did see your hand, but I would perhaps like to come in at this juncture. If we think of a multilateral ecumenism, then I think we need to consider several things. The churches are so busy with themselves. They reflect so much on their own internal affairs. And this is certainly also true for the Orthodox churches around us, the Russian Orthodox Church, for example, with reference to the Ukraine conflict, but it's also true for the Protestant churches coming to grips with the Islamic movement or in general terms, we have so many internal problems. How do we deal with that if at the same time we want to fight for a unified, a more unified European movement? Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for your question. I would like to come back to the value, to the added value. Now, if we were not moving forward in this direction, I think we would be missing out on something very important, because I think the added value is very important. It's the essence of our faith to call upon our brothers and sisters to join forces and to represent them, especially those who do not have their own voice. So the question of the added value is a difficult one and can be understood a little bit in a different way. I think Sant'Egidio and Lampedusa, when these problems came to the fore, I think the Protestant movement in France really took the right decisions at that point and took up activities. I think that the society in which we live, which is very open, which is very tolerant, we can do great things. But of course, we perhaps have a tendency of observing our own navels too much. And we look at our internal structures, and the parishes are perhaps weakened by secularism as it moves forward in Europe. So we must make sure that we do not weaken each other, and we must, on the contrary, make sure that we promote cooperation across the borders between the churches and also between the societies. And we also commit to a certain way of community life, and we need to definitely overcome looking at ourselves only and first and foremost. We do have a capacity and a facility to work with each other. So more engagement in foreign policy is perhaps a very good solution in order to avoid looking at internal problems too much. Working at a unified Europe, is that not a path that's been followed a little too much? And Well, I don't think that the Catholic Church itself is a monolith, and we do follow very different directions. So I think even amongst ourselves, we start a dialogue already. We do not regard that as a as internal matters. We feel that it's a dialogue from which we can all learn, because the churches are called upon to service God and the people at the same time. And I think that it can best follow its mission if it is very conscious of this double mandate. And I think that CEC or the CEC and COMICI are really at the juncture of representing the views and wishes of others, even the Jewish and the Muslim communities. Should obviously have a say, but they don't have the structure in place, perhaps, to be able to enter into such dialogues. But I do feel that it's worth the effort to talk about justice, peace, the environment amongst each others. Sometimes we find better listeners amongst the non-Christian politicians than amongst the Christian ones. Oh, excuse me, I would like to add something directed at Father Miron. The Neo-Apostolic Church in Luxembourg has for a long time been integrated into our Council of Churches in Luxembourg. So to learn from Luxembourg means to learn to win. Well, so it can have some positive effect on looking at ourselves, but there are more pressing problems around us, so we must get involved in finding more peaceful and sustainable solutions for all. So we must certainly work at the same time at the smaller internal problems, but also at the huge external problems. Let me take up the question of the community of values of the churches in Europe. How important is it for you to consider the churches a Christian community of values? Father Miron. Yes, well, one of the main features of Europe is the multilingualism, and we need interpreters. And I always maintain that the best interpreters should be the churches, because they're close to the heart of all the people. And it's exactly like the Cardinal just said it. Two Catholic bishops' conferences belonging to the same church represent completely different positions. And that's how I imagine your work. You will, as the COMICI, move in and try to bring them closer to an understanding. And the CEC will probably go to the brothers and sisters in Eastern Europe and talk about proselytism or other terms. Will ask them, why do you understand it in quite such a way? I think that this task to translate, to interpret between societies, between churches and denominations must become a pressing priority. It is very urgent to move forward in this area. And we should not simply sit back, relax, and trust that we've already solved the European problems and can now make the rest of the world happy. That would be my appeal. Interpreting, translating, understanding, that would be the mandate of Ökumenischer with observation, dialogue. Is it also a task of mediation, perhaps? And we don't mediate, I would say, not in the theological positions of the different bishops' conferences. That is certainly not our mandate. But if a house is on fire, you can discuss forever how big the water tanks should be in order to put out the fire. But I don't think you get the job done properly. The best thing is to become active right away, use all the water you can get your hands on and put out the fire. And I think that is perhaps an analogy to how you can work amongst Christians in Europe. And I was wondering whether that's not a good picture for refugees, because if we can see that refugees die in the Mediterranean, then we should not wait. We should not hesitate. We should go out and rescue them from the open sea. And I think that the disciples also had their same characteristic as we have them today. They were so diverse, so different, but the experience with Jesus Christ changed them, changed their lives, changed their way of thinking. And I think that remains our task, to understand and to see how people live and why. The reality behind our idea of a church and what we should be and what we can achieve is perhaps not quite realistic. So I think that we're also called upon to change ourselves. And I am utterly convinced that we in Europe are disciples of the one Lord, and every one of us can change. And it also brings a certain new understanding within Christianity. I think we needed a just level of modesty and the capacity to take up the dialogue with the non-believers, because I'm convinced that we can change the world just a little bit for the better. And we do that because we live the gospel. Let me come in again. You were talking about this metaphor of the house on fire. Now, picture yourself in a room that's on fire, which could be Catholic or Protestant or Lutheran. And one of the questions put here in the chat by one of the participants is the question on the position of women. Now, how do you put out that fire? Well, first of all, together with the women. In the Catholic Church, I have never read that the baptism of a woman is worth less than that of a man. And that is the first sacrament that we receive. So we should also take the consecration very seriously, and well, certainly one after the other, and we should certainly put out that particular fire together with the women, because I'm very convinced that they are much stronger than most of the men. They won't give up easily. Yeah, that's what we can observe with Maria 2.0. Is that on the agenda of the Ecumene also, or is it just an internal topic for the Catholic Church? I would perhaps like to ask Christian Krieger on the equal opportunities for women, because the Lutherans also had a problem with it. I don't think it's such a pressing topic in the CEC. We very often discuss the gender question, and when we talk about the community of values, we talk of human rights, and very often we start discussing the gender question, and it's difficult. I have to admit that much, but the dialogue is also very interesting, and it is a trigger for discussing these subjects amongst ourselves, because the institutions ask us about it. I think it's very important to have that internal debate, but for some in our families, it's difficult. So we do certainly take up our tasks and start talking about the difficulties. And if we meet personally with Cardinal Hollerich, we talk about it personally, but not in the name of our organizations. I should think that this is also a subject that can be talked about with the Orthodox Church.
Ja, gerade in einer der ganz großen
Germany, we have just in one of the large member churches, the Roman Catholic Church, the synodal way, the way of the synod. And here, people said right from the start, we also have something for you, the ecumenical sisters. We also have a bucket for you, if I may stay in the image, in the metaphor we heard a while ago. And ecumenicalism is part of this synodal way. And the gender question is also a central issue. So that this debate is a debate that has also reached the National Council of Christian Churches in Germany. And as to the synodal way, I can say that we in our theological body, we adopted faith and the order of the National Council. And this gives us the mission through the Lord's Supper and our debate to organize a study day and perhaps also a document in this respect, a document or a discussion day on the papers which are currently available from the Catholic Church or from the joint Protestant and Catholic churches on the table of the Lord, as it is called. You may know the name. So we're not in a vacuum here. It just happened that the other topic, which is also a very controversial issue, has been given priority in this synodal way. Well, if I may go back to the commitment for a unified Europe, we have already mentioned a few things in this respect: refugee policy, climate policy, for instance. And one development that is also preoccupying is that nationalisms seem to become stronger and stronger, so that countries go their own way again, and the churches have contributed to this a little bit, I think, especially when looking to Eastern Europe. What would you say? What could churches do in order to counter this nationalism in the individual countries and bring about more unifying force? Mr. Jollerich. Well, we have clearly taken a stance against populisms in Europe, but I'd like to distinguish between what we have in Eastern Europe and what we have in Western Europe. For a long time, we went historically different ways, and we didn't attempt endeavor a dialogue. At the time of the enlargement towards the east, the people in Eastern Europe thought it will, the people in Western Europe thought it will be very easy. Those in the east will just become like us. We're the good Europeans. But then they realized that those people have very different traditions and react in a very different way. So here, I believe we need a deeper dialogue. Instead of following antagonisms, we should more listen to the other side and should attempt to understand the other. That should be the first step. And we should be very, very honest in this dialogue and should also say what, as to the other, hurts us. I think this is the only way possible. And societies, in any case, are multi-layer and pluralistic, also in Eastern Europe, and even the church, even the bishops in the conferences are different. So in the East, we need more dialogue. In the West, we have to stop populisms. Have I understood this well? Yes, because in the East, this populism has a connection to ideas of which we hoped that they had vanished from Europe. Maybe those ideas are not as strong as they used to be. We don't want to have public cremations of people, but the others, well, the others are clearly placed behind ourselves, and this is nothing that can be reconciled with the Christian faith. And I'm very worried that in Catholic countries or countries that used to be very Catholic, that religious symbols have now been taken over by populisms. If I see a politician with a rosary who says that we should leave the people drown in the Mediterranean because then we get rid of them, and that is also the best to combat the traffickers, well, then I could only tell this person that the rosary is there to be used in prayer. And then the perception of that person, maybe, if he followed my advice, would change over time. So let's look towards the West. In the West, I think we have to say that church symbols should not be abused. And as to the East, in those countries in which, according to our perception, democratic values are in jeopardy, freedom of opinion, for example, freedom of religion, well, that is should be part of that open dialogue, of that honest dialogue, so that we could tell the other side also the things that are a problem for us. Mr. Krieger, I'd like to say two things on this. First of all, it is also our task as Conference of European Churches to network churches. We have a closer contact, for example, with our member churches in Hungary, who are living through difficult times at the moment because they have taken a certain position as to the migrant question and have come under quite some pressure from their government. So this is a difficult question, and belonging to such a conference, to have such relations between churches, this is something very important, so that our Christian brothers and sisters in Hungary and other countries find our support and can continue on their way. And this networking, and that's the second thing I want to say, this networking also helps against populism, against the distrust many people have now when it comes to Europe. We haven't talked about Brexit yet, for example. And we can contribute to people feeling more European than before. And sometimes we also have reactions to those populisms in certain countries, which then mean that those people become more European. We organize also a summer school for human rights, which had populism several times already on the agenda. So we bring people from the East and the West together, also contributions from Muslims and Jews, because we want to deal with these questions jointly, religiously, in a cross-border way. And Ökumenischer also is a partner here. I often ask myself, I say, populism, well, isn't that a populist instrumentalization of fears, of dissatisfactions, i.e. of feelings? And my question is, what more could churches do to help out in a religious way here? Because we should not push people back, we should accompany them. And we should maybe help them out of a certain place where they are finding themselves now. That's a question we also have to face up to, I think. I'm very aware of that. And I'd like to pass the question on to Father Miron, as representative of the Orthodox churches, who also have their history with nationalisms. What can churches do in this respect? Well, that is the advantage when you have so many hats. One hat is always the right hat, isn't it? Yes, yes, yes. And I have to say, the drama hat, as to what I've heard, and I'd like to link in with what Mr. Krieger has said. In 2018, we were in Öresund at a plenary meeting of the CEC, and I was on a committee, the so-called worship committee, which was responsible for the services during this conference. And one of the service had the topic healing of memories, as I'd say in good ecumenical German, because we very often use English in German. In any case, we tried to set a sign for peace in a city which a few years ago was bombed by NATO. Also from countries in which were the home of other member churches. So there were representatives also there from those nations and churches who, as the Cardinal said it a few minutes ago, a few years ago, were still considered enemies. Enemies because they bombarded us, in this case the Serbs. And that was a very, very difficult task we had here, a very tricky mission. And I'd like to compare that mission with what you're asking, namely with the question, how can we manage to find understanding for one another? First of all, we have to listen, yes. I remember one meeting prior to that conference in which Serbian representatives of various denominations told me, we expect an excuse from you. We expect that you say that you were at fault. It's not enough if you say we pray for peace and nobody wants war. No, we expect you to do a little bit more. And this expectation came quite as a surprise for some who did not expect that, because that was for them a war which they had not really discussed very much. They had not really thought about very much. So there's different reading or interpretation of history in the East and in the West. This is something that we, and now I'm answering your question, that we as Orthodox churches are very busy dealing with. I've mentioned it. I'm from a community of exiles, of immigrants, who after '89 were extremely happy that freedom, liberty, freedom of religion became possible in the East, and who, as a matter of fact, also were hoping that historical injustices would be tackled. In some cases, we're still waiting for that, also inside the churches, I have to say. So it's important now to listen very carefully. And for listening, you need two, the one who listens, but also the one who talks. And we try to manage this among churches with our sister churches. The family is quite large, as we all know. And we attempt this with our sister churches in the East. We probably have the same difficulties a Protestant Christ has when he hears a strange position of an Eastern European Protestant who seem to stem from decades or centuries ago. Well, we have the same problem sometimes in our churches. And what we attempt then to do is to listen really well, to ask questions, to have tales told to us, and then also to understand the skepticism towards Europe that has been mentioned here, which also exists. Then also the skepticism as to ecumenicalism. And a few months ago in our organization, we were to have an ecumenical officer. We wanted to have this in our rules, but then people said in our church, this is not possible. We cannot have such a person. Now the person is called officer for internal relations, so you have to be innovative. Yeah, and you have to listen a lot. I understand this. Mr. Hollerich also said that. And our participants are a little bit more impatient. Somebody asks, couldn't a unification of European churches not have a positive influence concretely on the Polish and Hungarian church as to refugees? I mean, the problems are really very urgent. So we cannot discuss for months. Isn't there something the church can do right now? Professor Hollerich. We also act. It's not that we also have the dialogue inside the Catholic Church. That's not our mission. Our mission is the dialogue with the institutions of the European Union. We have never done anything against the positive policy of refugees. The committee opinion is the same as the opinion of the Pope, and I will never do something differently. Also not for another, and another president won't do that either.
Ein bisschen schubsen, die das brauchen.
Das tue ich wahrscheinlich.
But perhaps you need to push a little bit those other churches who need a little push. But of course, reaching out to the national churches directly is more difficult. Yes, indeed. I would like to perhaps reformulate that. I think it's a benediction or a blessing for the churches that in internal meetings we can discuss all these questions, like the question that was raised earlier on about the status of women. I think it's very important that churches stand together. And that's very important for me, that the CEC stands together. We help those who have difficulties moving forward by talking to them, by using the avenues of the dialogue in order to create the understanding. It's much more easier to move forward that way than having somebody from outside who comes in. And I think it's very important to use also the format of dialogue in the ecumenism, and in this particular movement, you won't be able to reach results overnight, I don't think, but we are on our way, and I'm very grateful for that. Okay, I would like to open the floor again for participants, and I would like to ask Mr. Behrens to join us. Yes, thank you very much. Good evening to you all. I would like to put into focus the erosion of democracy in Europe. I think that's a major problem, and all the societal actors must be aware of it and must consider how to find solutions. There's a World Parliament of Religions active, and they also have approved an ethos. Don't we need something like a European Parliament of Religions, or perhaps a European Parliament of Christian confessions and denominations? And I'm talking about the smaller churches, the Adventists, the Mennonites, the Methodists, and the New Apostolic Church that was already mentioned. If they sent their delegates to such a parliament, it would reach a quorum, I should think, and there would also be a learning process put into place, learning internally inside the churches. How can you evolve, find new structures? The synodal way is what the Catholic Church calls it. You were talking about two different things. One, a joint body, the European Parliament, and the other one, the interchurch dialogue. Can I simply pass on that question? I think the idea is excellent, but it would also have to work. Because if we had next to the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church, the Reformed Church, the Orthodox Church also had a parliament of Christian churches, we would have an even larger mix of bodies. It is a nice idea, but I wonder whether it is realistic. It's something that remains to be seen. The proposal would have to be submitted by someone, and others would have to take it up. And I am pretty much convinced that as a Catholic, I wouldn't be talking about the democracy of churches. I would rather consider a new way of synod, of a synod approach. And even the Pope mentioned this, and I don't want to be misunderstood. Please don't take it as the German understanding of the synod, but it may have a different role to play, because there are different denominations active within the European churches, and they all should have their say, of course. The important objective must be to find consensus in the Holy Spirit. And that means that we would have to really be listeners first and foremost in a humble way. So the CEC and Commissy are very little present in the parishes. Those are sort of heading top organizations which are not really connected with the base of the church. Do we perhaps need a fourth European ecumenical convention or another Christian convention like the European Churches Convention? What do we really need? Mr. Krieger, yes, I would also like to take up this last question. A parliament of churches in Europe, what would be the competences of that parliament? I remember that the community of European churches, the Reformed and the Lutheran churches have tried to come up with joint ideas, but it's very difficult because the question of the mandate is so hard to define. I think that the very interesting way forward would be the one which you just described, Mrs. Alstau. It would be my hope that we would have a next ecumenical assembly in 2026. That is the target date. It would be the 25th anniversary of the Carta Ecumenica. And I really dream and hope that we can jointly organize it with the European Christian Convention, because I think that that sort of movement in conjuncture with an ecumenical Kirchentag would be able to move things forward. Something that would really change our ways of doing business with each other, of organizing new activities. The Charta could perhaps also be renewed and overhauled. The whole question of migration was never taken up in the Charta, nor was the question of the climate change. For example, questions of security under the threat of terrorism, for example, were never dealt with. That's something that I would really would like to work for. Well, I would have liked to say amen to this, but we're not quite at the end of our meeting yet. Father Miron, well then let me say amen to what Christian Krieger just said. The question about the competencies of such a parliament is the right question. It's interesting to note that the ACK is present on 3 levels. At the federal level, 26 churches cooperating at this level, and they are one working group, one joint body, but we also have the 16 regional ACKs, 14 regional. And in many, many different cities, we also have local working groups of the Christian churches. The name ACK is not protected by law. Any association can call itself ACK, but we do have a quality marker. Like, for example, using the same logo on all the different levels, and we don't have a problem with that. with any sort of a patent on it, for example. But obviously, we cannot give each other orders. For example, the federal level cannot simply hand down an order. And sometimes, depending on the general atmosphere, even the suggestion to take up a certain a subject is met with denial. And we sometimes get a reply which says more or less that we are independent of your federal working group. What it is, however, always very welcome if we help them with the work, like, for example, theological documents, flyers, brochures, preparing worship services, which would be drafted on a high professional level and be made available for the local parish churches. Now, that's something that works very well. And I believe it's part of our communication. And it probably rings a bell in other ecumenical bodies. Of course, we must take up our experiences and share resources, as they would say in Geneva. Without, however, infringing on the autonomy or the right to self-determination of the local bodies. That's a bridge we always try to cross, and our experience is pretty positive, I have to say. So I think the great distance between an organization and the local activity level is not so present. But if we were thinking of an event or a gathering, it would also have to be attractive for the ACK churches. I look at the watch and I also look at the chat. 4 persons have asked for the floor, but Cardinal Hollerich, you certainly have the first go. I would like to take up the suggestion of Christian Kriger. Speaking as the president of Ökumenischer, I would say, obviously, we are tasked to maintain the dialogue with the institutions, but as a bishop and a Catholic Christian, I think that your proposal is excellent. Personally, I can only support it. And I don't fear the layman, the basis of the church. I really do have a lot of contact with the believers, but only in Luxembourg, says Father Miron. I do trust them wholly and fully for trying to organize a huge gathering with such a format. Thank you very much, Cardinal. Many are really active in the ECC, in the European Christian Convention, and we're very happy to hear your positive support. I would like to take up Ms. Grüneberg and Ms. Schönberg for a short a question, and then 2 further participants. Ms. Grüneberg. Can you hear me? Yes. I think I could talk non-stop until tomorrow morning. I'd rather not. But you really took up everything that I burn for. And I am fascinated about everything that you've said. It's so rewarding to hear what you said, and I'm really so happy to know that God is with us, and I would like to pick up all those who stray and who are still looking for their way. We really want to take them on board, and Jesus really liberates us so that we can liberate one another. Thank you very much, Ms. Grüneberg. That is definitely a very nice motto for this webinar. And I would like to pass the floor to Ms. Schönstein. You will have to unmute yourself.
Ist sie vielleicht gerade nicht da, dann nehme ich...
She's probably not there right now. So let me pass the floor to Mr. Lutz Scholten. Thank you very much. That's perhaps a very late question, but I gather from the debate that in the ACK in Germany, we cooperate with the Catholic Church, and we found a basis for moving forward. And I am really surprised to learn about these results, because in the CEC, we have not achieved quite that much. And I think what Cardinal Hollerich said is very important. You need to find a close cooperation. You don't need parallel structures. It's always better to be sitting around the same table. So perhaps the World Churches Council and the CEC and all the different bodies should again discuss whether they're on the right track, because the ACK seems to work perfectly well. Ms. Schönstein is there now, so I'd like to pass the floor to her now. Please.
Maybe
Doesn't seem to be that simple.
We cannot hear you. Maybe your
We
mic
don't
is still
hear
on
you,
mute.
I'm afraid. Although your
Christian
mic seems to be unmuted.
Well, I'd like to distinguish
Mr.
between two
Krieger,
things.
yes, I would like to
Two structures
differentiate between
that
two.
it cannot have joint working structures. For
things.
example, I take that paper with our analysis of the project of the Portuguese presidency. Well, here we had one working structure which drafted a paper, and despite the fact that we have CEC and COMICE, we could cooperate. And as I explained a while ago, it makes sense that we do certain things only inside CEC so that we find our structure for cooperation with other churches. But when it comes to European questions, we don't have two working structures. We very often work in one and the same working structure. Thank you very much. Two more questions from the public. And then, unfortunately, I have to close the speakers list. Mr. Fabian, please.
Herr Fabian, gerne.
Mr. Fabian, you have the floor. Yes, can you hear me now? Yeah. Yes. I wanted to mention another issue which has partly been discussed already. I think that the issues of the Council, Congress, peace, justice, and so on are issues which have to be updated. And I believe that this is a good occasion for trying out what could be done jointly. In an ecumenical process, we could develop such approaches. I think this could be a possible approach, and this would mean that we would continue a tradition which also exists in ecumenicalism. Thank you very much, Mr. Fabian. Mr. Fleischmann, I give you the floor right away. Mr. Fleischmann, you would have to switch on your mic. Yes, Now we can hear you. Yes, Raimund Fleischmann. Mr. President Krieger, you spoke about a possible cooperation with the ECC. My question would be, would it also be possible to have a cooperation between the ECC and the Christian Organization Together for Europe? Would something like that would be possible, or does it maybe even exist already? Thank you very much. Well, I can answer this. We already have a contact with this group. We are in talks, and I think there will be developments. Thank you very much, Mr. Fleischmann. So now I'll try again, Ms. Schönstein. Could we, sounds like we can hear somebody? No, not really. Sorry, it's sometimes a little difficult. So sorry. And this means that we are approaching the end of our meeting. We talked about a lot of different things, talked about your personal biographies, about your experiences, about your organizations, and about the cooperation with ECC. I'd like to give you one question for the final round, which is a very current question, has to do with the current problems and challenges. And that would be the final question. In the Revelation of St. John, there is this letter in which St. John, through the Holy Ghost, tells what he likes, what gives him pleasure. And as if you were to write a letter to the angel of Europe, what would be in that letter? What would you tell the angel of Europe as to the future challenges? You as a president or head of your organization and as a Christian, what would you express in such a letter? Who would like to take the floor first? Yeah, I can take the floor first. I think I'd tell, first of all, thank you very much, Angel, because I think that Europe is an unbelievable success story, has been for the last 70 to 75 years. And this is something I'd like to thank the Angel for. There were enmities, there were rivalries, there were hostilities in the past, and we changed all this and reached a time of peace. And then I'd like to tell the Angel that Europe will stay a necessity because the huge challenges before us are of a global nature. And they are challenges of a globalized world, and therefore they require global answers. The pandemic made that clear, climate change, migration crisis. And when it comes to democracy or fundamental freedoms and digitalization, artificial intelligence, for all these topics or issues, Europe is a necessity, and this is something I'd like to tell that angel. So, Cardinal Hollerich, I'd like to subscribe to sign up to the letter to the angel by Pascal Krieger, because he said all that can be said. I'd also thank the angel that we have unity in diversity in Europe, and I'd also ask him that we stay lively, that we don't end up in a world of consumerism in which we can only react to impulses given by others, so that we continue to shape actively the future, that we remain open for the future, and that we won't live in a Europe which is in jeopardy to be a Europe of power. The way other countries sometimes understand it, so that Europe remains a soft power which can mediate, which can balance things, which can build bridges in the world, so that the bonum commune the general good is something we don't forget. And this shouldn't count just for Europeans, but for all human beings in the world. Father Miron, what would you tell the angel? With microphone, please. Dear brothers, I'd like to be the third in your alliance, if I may ask this, but I'd also put this here into that envelope from Frankfurt, and would tell the angel, dear angel, please always keep Europe in mind, and when we forget to look at certain things, at certain of the different fields we were talking about now today, then we should not forget the word, have a look at it. Yes, have a look at it, listen. This is what you all have been doing in the last 2 hours. You here in the panel, Cardinal Hollerich, Christian Krieger, Father Radu, Konstantin Miron. Thank you very much for these 2 hours of participation, that you were so present, so authentic, so personal. Thank you also the organizations behind you. So I also want to thank all the participants very much who were patient enough to remain with us until the end. Thank you very much. This was a preliminary event. In 2026, we will see each other again at the latest. Thank you very much, and I leave the floor to Sven. Well, first of all, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Christina, for this great moderation of today's event. I think you could hear how big the potential is we have here if we see things from all these different points of views, from all these different angles, with all these different experiences, and debate these questions. And also when you read the questions from the public, you realized how rich they all were. And when you then consider what you made of them, then you see where our strengths lie. Then you see what we are able to when we bundle our strengths in Europe. And you also said or described that we are already Europeans, but only very few meet as Christians and as Europeans at the same time. We heard quite clearly what you said about all this. And I think this is something we are going to support in the future. We will continue to work on this topic. Thank you very much for your support. We have touched upon all the topics important in this respect, and this is also very valuable that we can talk so openly on all these things. And as to Christina, the question of the angel, I'd say that I'd write him an email to that angel, not a letter. And all those who watched us were informed via email about our event. So the digitalization makes it possible for us, the Christians in Europe and worldwide, to come together quite easily, which would have been able before only with a huge effort. Now it's become very easy thanks to the email. And here in our religions, from our parishes, we can talk directly to church leaders. And this can make us strong, can make us interesting also for younger people. So I think there is a lot of room we still can fill. And the ecumenical process for peace, justice, and conservation of the creation is an important topic, but our task is not to take positions, but to open a room in which Christians can come together in their diversity, discuss things, develop things, can take responsibilities, and can celebrate their faith. And we're going to carry on this impulse of today's meeting. And I'm very glad when more people join our organization. You can register for our newsletter. This is also a good sign because it shows that you want to participate with us. So I hope there will be a follow-up. And I think we have tasted blood now, and we are going to follow this trace now. Many greetings to Luxembourg, but also to all the other places where you are, Lisbon, Frankfurt, in Switzerland. Europe is here to stay, and all those who will follow the Kirchentag in Germany. I wish you a very successful Church Congress. All the best, bye-bye, and thank you very much. Un grand merci. Bye-bye und au revoir.